The hand on her shoulder came at 0640. Not a tap. A grip. The kind that does not ask but informs. You are leaving this room, the grip said, and the only variable is whether you leave smoothly or with difficulty. Major Dennis Farrow had large hands and had been using them to move people in and out of spaces for 19 years, and he put one of them on the left shoulder of the woman in the third row of the briefing room and leaned down to say, quietly, the thing he had been sent to say. "This briefing is need to know," he said. "You need to step out." The briefing room was a converted operations tent at FOB Lindsay, 41 people seated in 7 rows facing a projected map of the Kunar province. The mission overlay still loading on the screen, red lines and grid coordinates and phase lines, and the blue diamonds that represented the assault element that would move at 0300 the following morning. The room smelled of coffee and dust, and the specific tension of people who are about to be told something that has operational consequences for their lives. The woman in the third row did not look up from the notebook in her lap. She had been writing in it since she sat down, small, precise handwriting, filling the left page of an open spread, a series of notations that the man beside her had glanced at twice and not been able to decipher. "Ma'am," Farrow said. She finished the sentence she was writing. She closed the notebook. She looked at the projected map on the screen. 1 look, 2 seconds. The look of someone taking a photograph with their eyes rather than examining something unfamiliar. And then she stood. "Of course," she said. She walked out ahead of him, which was not the direction he had expected her to move, as though she already knew where the door was, which she did, because she had been in this tent before, a long time ago, under different circumstances, for reasons that were in a file that Farrow had never seen and did not know existed. The door closed behind her. Inside the room, the briefing continued. Before we go any further, if this story already has something tightening in your chest, hit that subscribe button right now and stay with me until the very last word. Drop a comment below telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story reaches. Because what that woman wrote, and what it meant for every person in that room, is going to take your breath away. Lieutenant Colonel Nadia Reese did not argue with Major Farrow in the space outside the tent. She stood in the early morning cold with her notebook under her arm and her coffee going cold in her other hand, and she looked at the mountains to the north, which she knew well. And she waited for whatever came next with the patience of a person who has learned that the correct response to most forms of institutional friction is to let it complete its arc without adding energy to it. Farrow stood beside her with the expression of a man executing an order he had not fully interrogated. "The S2 will come out when the overview is done," he said. "He can brief you on the elements relevant to your attachment." "That's fine," she said. He looked at her. She was 43, lean, with dark hair cut short and practical, and the kind of stillness in her face that either came from training or from having been in enough rooms where the wrong expression cost something real. She was wearing a uniform that had no unit patch on the left shoulder, which was not unusual for certain attachments, and no name tape, which was more unusual but which Farrow had been told not to ask about. Her rank was displayed. Her record was not. "What's your attachment?" he said, not impolitely, professionally curious. She looked at him. "Advisory," she said. He waited for more. More did not come. He nodded and went back inside. She turned back to the mountains. She had been looking at these particular mountains, in maps and satellite imagery, and once from a helicopter at low altitude in the dark, for 11 months. She knew the ridgelines. She knew the approaches. She knew where the creek beds ran in spring and where they dried in summer, and where a vehicle could move at night without its headlights, and where it could not. She knew the shepherd tracks and the false tracks and the location of a cave system 3 kilometers northeast of the compound that the current intelligence picture had identified as a possible cache site. which was an assessment she had made 14 months ago and written into a document that had moved through 4 levels of review before becoming an operational planning assumption. She knew the mission on the screen inside that tent better than anyone in that room. She had written it. The document was designated Operation Iron Veil, classification level that precluded its presence in any unclassified briefing system. Authored 14 months ago by then Major Nadia Reese in her capacity as a senior plans officer at a Joint Special Operations Task Force headquarters that was not publicly acknowledged to operate in this theater. It was 47 pages long. It contained a threat assessment, a course of action analysis with 3 variants, a detailed ground scheme of maneuver for a direct action mission against a target that had been identified through a combination of signals intelligence, human reporting, and pattern-of-life analysis that had taken 9 months to develop. It contained a contingency framework for 6 categories of mission degradation: compromised insertion, contact at the objective, loss of air support, casualty on the assault element, compromise of the exfiltration route, and communications failure. It contained an annotated map overlay that had been updated 11 times across 14 months as the intelligence picture evolved. It contained, on page 31, a specific assessment of the northern approach route that every previous planning effort had dismissed as non-viable due to terrain and estimated enemy observation posts, and a detailed argument with supporting imagery analysis and movement time calculations for why the northern approach was not only viable but was the approach least likely to be compromised, because it was the approach that the enemy had assessed as non-viable and had therefore not positioned to defend. That assessment was the operational hinge on which the entire mission turned. The assault element was going in from the north. Nadia had written that. She had written it after 3 weeks of studying imagery that the collection system had not flagged as significant, after building a hand-drawn terrain model on a table in her office at 2300 on a Tuesday, after calling a former instructor who had walked that specific ground in 2009 and asking him 7 questions about what he remembered about the ridgeline above the northern creek bed, after coming in on a Saturday morning and spending 6 hours running movement calculations at 4 different insertion points until the numbers for the northern approach produced a timeline that worked. She had written it alone, in a quiet office, at a classification level that meant the document could not be emailed, and could not be discussed, and could not be mentioned to anyone who had not signed the specific access agreement for Iron Veil, which meant that the 41 people in the briefing room at FOB Lindsay, who were being briefed on a mission overlay that had been derived from her planning document without attribution, because attribution at this classification level was a security liability, not an acknowledgement, did not know that the route they were taking and the scheme of maneuver they were being briefed on and the contingency plans they were being handed had been produced by the woman who had just been asked to leave the room. The S-2, Captain Arjun Mehta, came out of the tent at 0718. He was 29, thorough, with the slightly harried quality of a junior intelligence officer who is managing more information than his sleep schedule is prepared for. He had a tablet in one hand and a printed briefing summary in the other, and he had been told to give the advisory attachment a sanitized overview of the mission concept, which he was prepared to do professionally and efficiently. He found her standing where Pharaoh had left her, looking at the mountains with the notebook still under her arm and the cold coffee still in her other hand. "Ma'am," he said, "I can give you the unclassified overview." She turned. She looked at the tablet in his hand. "You're going in from the north," she said. He blinked. "The briefing." "I'm not asking," she said, not unkindly, precisely. "I know you're going in from the north. I'm telling you so that you know I'm familiar with the concept, and you don't need to walk me through the basics." He looked at her. "Northern approach was assessed as non-viable in previous planning cycles," he said carefully. "The current plan identified the enemy's observation gap above the northern creek bed at the 4-kilometer mark," she said. Used the shepherd track that runs below the ridge rather than the ridge itself. Planned the insertion for the 2-hour window between 0100 and 0300, when pattern of life analysis shows the enemy's northern position is minimally manned. Meta stared at her. She had just described, with operational specificity, elements of a mission plan at a classification level he had been explicitly told she did not have access to. "Ma'am," he said. "How do you?" She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and produced a credential card. She held it out. He looked at it. He looked at it for longer than credential checks usually require, which was because the access designation on the card included Ironvale, and Ironvale was the designation on the planning document that sat in the classified annex of the briefing he had just delivered. He looked at her face. Something was reorganizing itself in his understanding. "You have access to Ironvale," he said. "I wrote Ironvale," she said. The silence that followed lasted approximately 5 seconds, which is a long time for a silence between two people standing 2 feet apart. Meta looked at the mountains she had been looking at. He looked at the northern ridgeline. He thought about the planning document he had read 3 times in preparation for this briefing, the 47 pages with the author field redacted per classification protocol. The document that had reorganized the entire operational approach to this target, and that had, according to the task force historian's marginal note in the annex, been described by the JASOF commander as the best single planning product his headquarters had produced in 4 years. He looked at her. She was looking at the northern ridgeline. "The contingency on page 31, he said. "The exfil variant if the eastern route is compromised. Use the creek bed to the second shepherd structure," she said. "It runs below the enemy's observation coverage until the 4-kilometer mark, then cuts west below the ridgeline. You lose 40 minutes on the timeline, but you keep the element out of the compromised corridor." She paused. "Make sure the assault element commander has that memorized, not just printed. If comms go down, they need to be able to run it from memory in the dark." Meta looked at his tablet. He looked at page 31 of the mission annex on his screen. The creek bed, the shepherd structure, the 40 minute variants, the corridor avoidance. It was all there. Word for word, essentially, because she had written it word for word 14 months ago in a quiet office on a Saturday morning. "I need to make a call," he said. "You should," she said. He made it from inside the tent on the secure line, and the call went to the task force J2, who put him on hold for 90 seconds and came back and told him 3 things. That Lieutenant Colonel Reese's access was confirmed at the level he suspected. That her presence at FOB Lindsay was authorized and had been coordinated at a level above the FOB commander, and that if Captain Meta had any further questions about her clearances or her role, he should address them to the J2 directly, and not to anyone at the FOB. Meta walked back outside. She was still looking at the mountains. "The briefing is still running," he said. "Phase 2 is starting in 12 minutes. Mission rehearsal." She looked at him. "You should be in there," he said. She considered it. "Major Farrow," she said. "I'll handle Farrow," Meta said. He said it with the particular quiet confidence of a young officer who has just received information that has promoted his understanding of the situation to a level that changes his calculus. "You should be in that room." She looked at the tent. She thought about the 41 people inside it, who were about to rehearse a mission she had written, who would execute a northern approach she had argued for across 3 weeks of solitary analysis, who would use a contingency route she had mapped on a Saturday morning alone, and who did not know and might never know that any of this had come from her. "All right," she said. She walked back inside. Farrow saw her come through the door. He began to move toward her, the large hands already positioned for the second removal, the face already arranged into the expression of a man about to execute a repeat of a task he has already completed once. Meta intercepted him. He spoke quietly, quickly, for approximately 30 seconds. Pharaoh's face changed twice during that 30 seconds, once when Meta said something, and once when Meta showed him something on the tablet. The second change was larger and went deeper. The specific reconfiguration of a man who has made an assessment with confidence and has been shown the precise nature of its error. Pharaoh looked at Nadia. She was already in a seat. Not the third row, the front row, the row she should have been in from the start, beside the mission commander, Colonel Ray Ashby, who had been told by Meta via a quickly typed message on the secure tablet that the woman sitting down beside him had written the planning document his mission was built on. Ashby looked at her. He was 51, combat decorated, with a long operational history and the specific, careful respect for competence that senior commanders develop when they have seen enough missions go wrong to understand where success actually comes from. He extended his hand. She shook it. "Page 31, he said quietly, while the briefer was reloading the Phase 2 overlay. "The creek bed contingency. I read that 4 times. "It's the right route," she said. "If you need it." "I know," he said. "That's why I read it 4 times. The briefer called the room to attention for Phase 2. She opened her notebook. She began to write. The mission executed at Arrow 300 the following morning. The assault element moved in from the north, on the route she had assessed as viable 14 months ago, when every previous planning assumption had dismissed it, through the shepherd track below the ridgeline, through the observation gap above the creek bed at the 4-kilometer mark, through the 2-hour window when the pattern of life analysis showed minimal manning at the northern position. They reached the objective without contact. The cache site was where the intelligence assessment said it would be, the cave system 3 kilometers northeast of the compound, the assessment she had written into the planning document. The assessment derived from imagery that the collection system had not flagged, but that she had spent 3 weeks analyzing, because something in the pattern was worth 3 weeks. The mission completed in 4 hours and 11 minutes. The assault element exfiltrated on the primary route. They did not need the creek bed contingency, but the mission commander had it memorized. He had read page 31 4 times, and then he had gone through it with his element leaders, and they had walked the timing and the waypoints until it was in their bodies rather than on their screens. Because the woman who wrote it had told Meta to make sure they had it in their heads, and Meta had told Ashby, and Ashby had understood immediately why that instruction had come from someone worth listening to. 29 personnel came home from the Kunar that morning. The cache materials recovered from the cave system were assessed by the Task Force Intelligence Section as operationally significant, at a level that triggered 3 follow-on missions in the subsequent 30 days. The planning document that had produced the mission was updated with an after-action annotation in the classified archive. The author field remained redacted. Nadia was on a flight back to the task force headquarters at 0900. She had not slept. She had the notebook open in her lap, and she was writing in it. The same small, precise handwriting, the left page of a new spread. The initial framework of an assessment she had been developing for the past 6 days about a separate target set in a separate province that would eventually, if the analysis held and the collection cooperated and the review process moved at the pace she was going to insist on, become another planning document that someone would read 4 times and execute at 0300 in the dark. She did not think about the 41 people in that room. Not because she did not care. Because caring was not the point of the work, and making the caring visible was less than not the point. It was actively contrary to the point. The work was the plan. The plan was the route. The route was the people coming home. That was enough. That was more than enough. She turned the page. She kept writing. The most important work in any operation is rarely the work that happens under fire. It is the work that happens in quiet rooms at 2300 on a Tuesday, when no one is watching and the problem is not yielding, and there is no audience for the persistence required to stay with it until the answer comes. Nadia Reese did not write 47 pages because she was asked to perform effort. She wrote them because the problem was real, and the people who would execute the mission were real, and the consequences of a wrong answer were the kind that cannot be undone. The room that asked her to leave did not diminish the work. The credential card that got her back in did not validate it. The work had already been done, months earlier, alone, in a way that required nothing from anyone except the continued willingness to think harder than the problem demanded, for longer than was comfortable, on behalf of people who would never know her name. That is not a sacrifice. That is a calling, and the people who answer it are the reason the people in the briefing room get to come home and sit in the same room again the following morning and never once have to know how close it was, or who made sure it wasn't closer.